Today I'll talk about lessons from the UK Labour Party from a loss in 2019 to a supermajority in 2024. In 2019, Conservative won with majority of 365 seats and Labour with 202 seats. Now the minimum threshold for any political party to form a government is 324 seats. So in essence, the Conservative had the majority to form a government. Now the first thing that the UK Labour government did was to accept the defeat at the polls. That way it gives you the leeway to reflect and regroup the army and come up with strategies to close the gap between the loss and the win. Now, let's look at some of the strategies that were deployed by Labour. So the first thing that they did was to remove the leader. So the Labour Council decided to remove Jeremy Corbyn, who was then the leader of UKLabour Party, and his deputy, MacDonald. And in came a new leadership. Sir Keir Starmer became the new leader of the Labour Party, and the deputy was Angela Ryan. With the new leadership came new strategies. So from the day one, it became a march towards the next election within the 5-year period, deploying totally new strategies to make sure that the Labour Party captures both in terms of the voters' aspirations as they march towards the supermajority to number 10. The next thing that they did was to look at the leadership, was to look at the leaders that were surrounding the previous leadership. So here we are talking about the shadow cabinet. So the shadow cabinet was also interrogated, the spent force removed, and they became backbenchers, and new frontbenchers were appointed by the new leadership. And that became a golden thread right from the top to the ward. So we now have got a new leadership right from the national to the ward, with a new total mandate and a new approach in terms of strategies. So obviously the leadership knew exactly what they wanted to do and what they wanted to achieve within the 5-year period. And they didn't waste any day in between the 5-year in planning, deploying, coordinating, evidence-based research, including setting up political strategies at every level to advise the leadership on how deployment was going on, to advise the leadership in terms of what the people think about the policies of the party. By the way, you don't have to change the ideology or the policies of the party, but what you can do is to look at the policies and see which policies appeals better to the people, which have not been deployed by the incumbent government. And then look at those policies as well that the incumbent government has deployed, but have brought in some misery to the people. So you sort of single those out, and they become your weapon in terms of the campaign. Now, one might ask whether were there any challenges that the party faced during its march to supermajority. Of course there were, and there will always be, regardless of whether we're talking about the Western world or developing countries. I'll highlight some of them here. So during the period of 5 years, to be specific, about 2022, there was a delimitation commission. Most of you would understand that's boundary changes. So they review the boundaries of the constituencies to ensure that they are still valid in terms of population that is fair and evenly distributed. And normally, where there's delimitation commission or boundary changes, you find that the incumbent government tends to benefit from such an exercise. We're still in Africa, where elections just a rubber stamping exercise. Although in this case, in UK, I would say elections are relatively free and fair. I have to say relatively free and fair because there is no fair ground whatsoever anywhere in the world. You name it, whether you're talking about Europe or USA. So some of the constituencies which were predominantly and historically Labour were lost or merged with other constituencies. I'll give you an example. In Warsaw, for example, we had Warsaw South with a Labour MP, and there was Warsaw North with a Conservative MP. So we lost one constituency. So Warsaw South and Warsaw North were then combined. So what that means is that it neutralized the Warsaw South majority of Labour with the Warsaw North of the Conservative. So you are, in a way, fighting the unknown, whether you will win as Labour, because you've got sort of a 50-50 position in terms of whether you win or lose. That's one aspect. And this was the case in various constituencies. But again, I have to hasten to say it didn't disenfranchise Labour alone. There were certain constituencies where the Conservative South lost. But in a way, when taken in terms of totality, the Conservative gained 7 seats. Already you can see that this was a challenge for Labour. The next challenge for Labour came in 2023. So in 2022, they passed an Election Act 2022 introducing IDs at the voting polling stations. And this, again, was the first time since the history of the country. What that means is that you couldn't vote if you don't have an ID. And there was a list of IDs as a sort of a guideline for people, the license or the passport. Now, the initial reaction to many people was that it will affect more to Labour than it would be to Conservative. But again, we also needed sort of a data-driven and evidence-based argument on that. So again, through research, contacting people, door knocking, it was apparent that the majority of the people that were going to be affected were supporters of Labour. Again, the Conservative is predominantly a part of rich people who are conservative in their view of what they have. So it was bound to be the case that they drive, so they've got the driver's license, they go holidays, so they've got passports, so it was not an issue for them in terms of presenting an ID. Whereas Labour is a party of working class and also of poor people, who some of these, they don't drive, so they don't have a driver's license. They cannot afford to go abroad, so they don't have passports. And these people, what that means is that they have no ID. to show at polling station. And what do? You stay away. You can't vote. And voting being a game of numbers, you don't vote, then there's less votes. So in overall, when it is compounded, it disenfranchised about 2.8 million people who otherwise could have voted. Here I'm talking about the 2024 elections. But then you also need to look at the registered population. So registered population, 45 million people registered to vote in the UK. So those were the challenges that Labour faced. And again, these were monumental challenges, and nobody knew whether the ID issue would overturn or would become an obstacle in terms of Labour getting to power. But because there was coherent leadership, there was strategies deployed, there was data-driven campaigns, there was targeted groups, Labour was able to come up supreme with a supermajority. And it came as a shock that Labour eventually got 411 seats. And for the first time in history, Conservatives were demolished to 121 seats. But that didn't just reached in a vacuum or achieved in a vacuum. It was a combination of the various factors that I've alluded to. Change of leadership, deploying the right strategies, having the right strategic partners, having an army of volunteers that are conscientized in terms of the policies, manifesto, and what the party stands for, against the backdrop of harsh conditions, economic conditions by the incumbent. All these put together became the armory of Labour marching to number 10 with the supermajority. I hope this will give a lesson to a lot of political parties across the globe. It is indeed a textbook case which will be studied by many academics, researchers for many years to come. And thank you. Hope you have enjoyed this analysis.